Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. In today's fun classic motorcycle review, we'll be taking a look at Kawasaki's 1981 through 1982 KZ1000 CSR. In this video, I'll give a little bit of the history of the CSR. We'll also talk about the specs on the bike and the performance of the CSR. And in a little bit, we'll take the CSR out on the road to see what it's like to ride. So stay tuned for that. If you're like me and you like classic bikes from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, please like and subscribe. I feature lots of great classic bike content on this channel. Looking at the history of the CSR, in 1981, in response to some pretty tough economic times worldwide, Kawasaki introduced the CSR line, and it was a little bit lower cost line of motorcycles that was based on their LTD line of motorcycles. Looking at the 1000 CSR specifically, it was based on the 1000 LTD, and while the LTD sold for around $4,000, the CSR was about $250 cheaper. Looking at the differences between the CSR and the CSR featured spoked wheels versus the LTD's mag wheels. The CSR also had cable-driven gauges versus the LTD's electric gauges. The CSR also lost the self-canceling turn signals that were found on the LTD, and it did not have the smoked taillight lens of the LTD. The CSR also had a little bit simpler paint schemes on it than the LTD did. The good news is, however, that the motor is exactly the same, the chassis is the same, the brakes are the same, the suspension is the same, and really functionally, the CSR is every bit as good a motorcycle as the LTD was. In 1981, Kawasaki completely redesigned the 1000cc motor that was found in the CSR and the GPZ and the KZ1000J. It still featured the roller bearing crank, but it was a completely new design. Compared to the previous KZ1000 motor, it featured a higher compression ratio. It also had larger CV type carbs. It had larger intake tracks, larger valves. It had higher lift cams and hotter cam timing. It was 15 pounds lighter than the motors found in the previous generation of KZ1000s. It was also more powerful and had more torque. In the LTD and the CSR, it was tuned for mid-range and low-end power. The motor displaces 998 cc's. It's an air-cooled inline-4. It has dual overhead cams. It features 2 valves per cylinder. The motor had electronic ignition. It was fed by a bank of 34mm CV type carburetors. These were Mikuni carburetors. The engine in the CSR was mated to a slick shifting 5-speed transmission and chain final drive. If we look at the frame on the bike, it is a steel tube cradle type frame. This frame was based on the KZ1000J frame, so it actually handles very nicely. And in addition to that, it is also a very lightweight frame. Looking at the suspension, the CSR had conventional front forks. They were air adjustable. Out back, it featured the dual conventional style shocks with spring preload and rebound damping adjustment. In the braking department, the CSR had big dual disc brakes up front and single piston calipers acting on those. Out back, it had a large single disc brake with a single piston caliper acting on that. The CSR had a 3.9 gallon fuel capacity and it sported the cruiser styling of the LTD model. And that means more of a rounded peanut style tank. It also had the step seat, and in 81 they got rid of the ducktail on the KZ1000 LTD. Some people like this styling and some people like the classic KZ1000 LTD styling better. The seat height on the CSR was a low 30.8 inches. And one of the real benefits on the CSR is it's very lightweight for a 1000cc bike. It only weighs 546 pounds completely full of fuel. It's actually lighter than the 750s from Suzuki and Honda of the time. And it actually contributes to the CSR's really good performance and really good handling. Performance-wise, at the crank, the CSR made right around 95 horsepower and 63 foot-pounds of torque. And that was good enough for the CSR to clock off an 11.88 second quarter mile at right around 115 miles an hour. Top speed on the CSR was between 125 and 130 miles an hour, depending on the source you look at. Looking at the instrumentation on the CSR, it features a large speedometer and a large tachometer that are front and center. It has a fuel gauge, and that's something that the Honda cruisers didn't have at the time. nor did the Yamaha cruisers. All right, enough talk. What is the CSR like to ride? I'm gonna gear up, I'll bring the camera along, let's find out together. Let's ride.
I am currently riding Kawasaki's 1981 KZ1000 CSR. And in my mind, the KZ1000 CSR has kind of been the ugly stepchild of the KZ1000 line. It never got the respect of the LTD or the standard style models or the sport models. But that doesn't really mean it's a substandard product. And to me, these things are such a good classic bike value. Componentry wise, they have the same performance as the LTD, and that was a great bike. Just generate speed very quickly. Very uncruiser-like. Not only does it have very nice engine performance, but this bike is such a lightweight and such an awesome handling machine on back roads. Corner turn-in is very, very nice. One of the complaints that these got in stock form was that the carburation could be a little bit snatchy on and off throttle, especially at lower RPMs, and I do notice that on this bike. I have messed with the jetting to try to kind of get that a little bit better, and while it's improved, it is still just a little bit abrupt on and off throttle at times. But again, it's at very low RPM, and I don't normally notice it while riding. One source that I read said that the motor in this bike is rubber mounted. I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't get a ton of vibration through the seat, but I definitely get some through the bars. Going up through the gears on this bike is so entertaining. I've got the Delcathic pipe and it just sounds great under hard acceleration. The seating position on this bike is very neutral. It's very comfortable. The bars are close enough to me that it's not really a reach. It's just a nice, comfortable sporting stance. I've upgraded the brake lines on this bike to Spiegler steel braided brake lines, and the stopping power is awesome. I'm a taller guy, and so the dished out cruiser seat gets confining over time. I'd much rather have a flatter, more open seat on this bike where I could move around and change my seating position a little bit. Since I can't change my seating position, I end up sinking through the foam in about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and it just makes this bike not that comfortable for longer distance rides. But man, is it entertaining on these shorter rides. This motor is a real gem. It pulls from idle to red line. It's very quick, very peppy, very entertaining, and I definitely like the sound of it. That's a riot. The only thing holding this bike back performance-wise currently is the stock rear shocks, and I am seriously contemplating upgrading those to a better performing set of shocks, and that would really make this thing a solid handling bike. It already handles nice, but it would be really top-notch with new shocks. With the lighter weight of the CSR and the quicker revving nature of its motor and the more sensitive throttle take-up that it has when you get on the throttle, this bike really feels like a sport bike. And for me, when I ride this bike, it's hard to be good. It's the kind of bike that puts a big smile on your face every time you go up through the gears. I love the sound from the Delcovic exhaust. I love the way that it turns in easily into corners. And this CSR is just the kind of bike that has me looking for beautiful, curvy back roads. That's awesome.
All right, man, what a lot of fun. Every time I ride the CSR, I am reminded that it was spawned from sport bike genes. Performance-wise, the CSR was less than a second slower through the quarter mile than the best performing super bikes of the time period. That sporty nature comes through. It's a little bit edgy. This newer generation of KZ1000 motor is really a gem. It's very quick revving, it's soulful, it sounds good, it's very entertaining to ride. It's got smooth power from 2000 RPM all the way up to the 8500 RPM redline. And the light handling is superb. Very easy bike to go fast on. It just flows through the corners very nicely. It transitions nicely, and I really enjoy that aspect of this motorcycle. I purchased this bike several years ago as an all-stock example. I have done some light modifications to it to enhance the performance. Those modifications include adding a full Delcovic 4-into-1 exhaust. That sounds really nice. I rejetted the carbs for that. I also upgraded the brake lines with some Spiegler steel braided brake lines. And so that vastly improves the braking performance, and it really ups the safety of the bike. Another thing that really contributes to the good handling on the bike is the lower and wider MGO Magna wide handlebar that I put on here. That really transformed the handling from something that was somewhat sketchy in the corners with the buckhorn handlebars. They pull back and they don't give you any leverage. And these are nice and wide, and now I have all sorts of leverage and I can really throw the bike around in the corners. So that's a huge upgrade. To me, the 1981 KZ1000 LTD and CSR were kind of conflicted bikes. On the one hand, they were solidly marketed as cruisers, bikes that you could just go and style on. And when you think of a cruiser, you think of a more relaxed motorcycle. And that's not really the nature of this bike. It's more of a hot rod. If I'm going to nitpick the bike, I would say because it's the cruiser style, it has a smaller gas tank and much more limited range. It's really not designed to be a touring bike. I also don't really care for the stepped cruiser style seat. The stock rear shocks on this bike would also benefit from being replaced with some newer, better performing units. Because the KZ1000 CSR was considered kind of the ugly stepchild of the KZ1000 line, its prices have remained somewhat reasonable, and I think it represents an incredibly good classic bike value. I'm personally not much of a cruiser fan, and so I really like the sporty nature of the CSR, and I love the fact that it responds very well to a couple of inexpensive performance modifications, and it really makes this bike a fun hooligan bike to ride, and I just have a blast every time I ride it. All right, I'd love to know what you guys think. If there are any CSR or LTD fans out there, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.